I'm shocked that you don't know what a dobro is, first of all. I'm shocked by the number of students that came to me, though, asking if I would be bringing my dobro with me to play here. And I thought, you don't know me well. You know me sort of well. You know me well enough to know that I love my dobro, but you don't know me well enough to know that I would not pass up an opportunity to speak on the Old Testament here at an opportunity like this. My wife is here, my son and daughter-in-law, my mother-in-law. There's some other guests here. And I thank you guys for coming and for being here. It does mean a lot. My mother-in-law is one of the guests, and I know that when I'm done, she'll need to return to Richmond, and so I think I can finish this in 10 minutes. That should be good for everyone. She is my favorite mother-in-law. So I do want to thank the president, Danny Aiken, and the administration for the opportunity to deliver our faculty lecture this semester. I was surprised a few weeks back in chapel when John Ewart was here. He stood here, he was preaching, and he said, to my surprise, that he had previously preached here in chapel 13 years ago. I thought, wow, that's a long time. And I thought John Ewart should have been here more often than that, but apparently not. I was surprised for a number of reasons. First of all, because it turns out that I knew what he preached on 13 years ago. And there's a story as to why I know that, but I'm not going to share that right now. But the second is that I've just finished my 13th year here at Southeastern. I'm in my 14th year of teaching. And so I'm assuming that there must be a pattern then of getting to preach every 13 years or getting to speak in chapel. And so just to head this off, I don't know what committees are in charge of this, but I'm assuming then that I would expect my next invitation to come sometime around my 70th birthday in 2034. And so just to give ample time for preparation, I'm hereby notifying whatever committees are involved that I do accept the invitation to speak here in 2034. I'll let you pick the date. I'm going to begin today. The title of this lecture, by the way, is Redeeming Ephraim. And it's finding a place for the northern kingdom in a biblical theology. But I want to begin just with a word about what it means to do Old Testament studies. Why does one pursue studies in the Old Testament? What sort of a person is it that does such a thing? To students here, you may be surprised to hear such a question, but the reality is that disciplines attract persons of a certain type. It may be a skill that you have or an interest. In other cases, it may be a temperament of a certain type. New Testament scholars have certain dispositions to them, systematicians others, historians others still. Now, it should be clear to those on the campus at Southeastern that there are a number of qualities common to the Old Testament faculty. Among those that should go without saying, but which I will mention for the benefit of those not privileged to be on campus and working amongst the students and faculty here are, of course, a keen intellect, insightful wisdom into the meaning of Scripture, but also a sharp wit, a sense of humor, accompanied by dashing good looks. But there is another characteristic which, while I don't intend to foist this on all of my Old Testament colleagues, it has marked my own thinking in terms of the Old Testament, but just life in general, and that is that I am a contrarian. If the group is in this place over here, I will quickly move to the opposite corner. If the group says yes, I will quietly offer a contrary position. This attitude of mine became clear to me one day in high school. I had been invited by a friend to spend part of my summer vacation with him and his family up in Lake Tahoe on the California-Nevada border. While we were there, a group of us were playing miniature golf, or putt-putt, or mini golf, or whatever you call it here. In California, it's miniature golf. While we were playing our game, one of the party looked at me and commented, "Hey Todd, do you realize that you are the only person in our group not wearing Nikes?" And I looked at my shoes, and I looked around at the 8 or 10 people that were in the group there, and I said to myself, well, thank you for pointing that out. Now I know I will never wear Nikes again. but such is the way my brain tends. Once you point out what the group is doing, I'm going to try to do something different. I believe that there is in those who pursue Old Testament studies a certain degree of contrariness, of saying to the group, I don't really care what you think. This can get us into trouble at times. At others, I think it can help push us in directions that need to be pursued. We can ask questions that others might not want to ask. I am, of course, presenting this as a sort of heroic position, the romantic idealist, Beethoven against Napoleon, if you will. We can, however, also be frustrating colleagues in faculty meetings and terrible bores at parties, but such is life. Now, to get into the problem that we are addressing here, the title of this lecture is Redeeming Ephraim, Finding a Place for the Northern Kingdom of Israel in a Biblical Theology. The casual reader of the Bible may not think much about the Northern Kingdom of Israel. I can see three reasons for this neglect. First, since the division of the monarchy occurs in books that are not often read or preached, many Christians may simply be unaware of the basic storyline of the history of Israel and be unaware of the fact that the kingdom divided following the reign of Solomon and continued divided until the destruction of Samaria and the end of the northern kingdom under the Assyrians in 722 BC. For others, more knowledgeable of the larger biblical narrative, they may be aware of the fact of the division, but have little understanding why it happened, either politically or theologically, or why it might be important for a fuller understanding of the Bible. Still others have a good grasp of the facts of the Old Testament narrative and understand that the books of Kings give theological evaluations about each king of Israel and Judah. They are well aware of the fact that while the Judean kings were a mixed bag, some judged favorably, most unfavorably, the kings of the northern kingdom were universally judged to be idolaters and unfaithful to Yahweh. In fact, these students of Scripture would be well aware of the causes of the division, going back to the foolishness of Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, when he rejected the wise advice of his elders and instead followed the foolish advice of his peers. These same folks would know that the fate of the northern kingdom, that because of their wickedness, they were sent into exile in 722 BC by Yahweh and under the hand of the Assyrians. But finally, if they not only have been reading their Bibles faithfully, but also paying attention during Bible studies and perhaps reading a commentary or two, they would also know that this exile was unlike the exile of Judah, which followed about 150 years later, in which the exiles were taken away together and allowed to live in Babylon in exiled communities. Rather, it was one in which the Assyrians scattered the exiles among different groups and brought exiles from other nations to live in the conquered space, resulting in the loss of identity of the exiles as a discrete nation. The inhabitants of the northern kingdom were to a very great extent lost to history. Now, in my own growth as a Christian, raised in church Sunday school programs, growing into a more mature Bible reader, and finally a seminarian, and now an Old Testament professor, I can see myself in each of these descriptions at various points in my life. But then questions begin to arise. Why would so much of the Old Testament narrative, for example, the extended stories of the northern prophets Elijah and Elisha, why would so much of the Old Testament narrative be taken up with a people that were rebellious at the outset and apostate at every turn? Why would there be a number of prophetic books, I'm thinking of Hosea and Amos, devoted entirely to address this apostate people? Then there was another question separate from this that arose, and this puzzled me as a young Bible reader, and which became more puzzling the more I learned of the biblical narrative. And that is, when we go back to the book of Genesis, why is there so much space devoted to Joseph in the book of Genesis when the storyline of the Old Testament was directed through Judah? At the time, I thought this question was unrelated to my first question about the northern kingdom. But what I came to realize, to paraphrase the words of Joseph to Pharaoh, is that the two questions are the same. Moreover, what greatly surprised me is the answers are the same to those two questions. In both cases, we know that the main story should be going in a certain direction through Judah, the son of Jacob, in the book of Genesis, and through the southern kingdom of Judah in the book of Kings. But the story of Joseph tells us of a completely moral and faithful Israelite who was brought from prison to freedom. The story of the northern kingdom tells us of a completely unfaithful people brought from freedom into captivity. In Genesis, Joseph is a completely ethical and sympathetic figure. He stands as an example for us. And in this way, the story of Joseph is very different than the story of the northern kingdom. Now, in today's lecture, what I would like to do is explore two main texts and comment briefly on a third section that appear to be underrepresented in telling the story of Israel in the Old Testament. My goal, and if the people from the Writing Center are listening here, this is my thesis statement. My goal at the end is for you to entertain the possibility that the Old Testament story of God's people runs from the election of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then includes Joseph and his son Ephraim as the primary recipients of God's blessing and the right of the firstborn. I'm going to repeat that. My goal at the end is for you to entertain the possibility that the Old Testament story of God's people runs from the election of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then includes Joseph and his son Ephraim as the primary recipients of God's blessing and the right of the firstborn. After the exodus from Egypt, and after the possession of the promised land and the institution of the monarchy under King David, the primary story of Israel continues after the division of the kingdom, principally through the northern kingdom, until the demise of that kingdom in 722 BC. The story, I believe, continues on from there, but if I can convince you thus far, I will consider my job here a success. Now, as you're hearing that, you may have questions arise, and let me at the outset deny a certain criticism of the views that I will express here. In showing that the Old Testament clearly portrays a significant role for the northern kingdom is not to deny that there is also a significant role for the southern kingdom. On occasion, I have been asked by a student following a presentation like what you will hear, so are you saying that Judah is not important? But Jesus comes from that line. And I reply, yes, Jesus does come from the line of Judah, and we must, if we are to read the Bible correctly, we must read the Bible Christocentrically. But we must be able to do several things at once. Reading the Bible Christocentrically does not mean that that is the only thing going on in the Bible. In fact, by overdoing any one single hermeneutical principle, we run the risk of missing a fuller message in the Bible. So let us affirm that the Bible has a Christocentric message that is rightly read through the line of Judah, and let us also see if the Bible has a sort of parallel message that runs through the northern kingdom. And what I have discovered is that the two parallel messages are interdependent. Now, the problem in past interpretation. The problem in understanding the role of Joseph and Ephraim in biblical theology is in part created by a hermeneutical method that is necessary, and I've kind of implied this in what I was just saying. But it is in part created by a hermeneutical method that is necessary, but which, when rigidly and exclusively followed, can lead to error. And I am speaking of the necessity of reading the Bible backwards. We must be able to read the Bible forwards and backwards. And that is, we not only read the work as we would a novel that slowly unfolds before us, but we also read the Bible backwards, knowing the end already at the outset. We learn this method of reading backwards, of course, from Jesus himself, when in Luke 24 he opened the minds of the disciples and explained to them how everything written in Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms, a circumlocution for the law, prophets, and writings, was about him. We are justified then in taking our final knowledge of a biblical theology and importing that into our forward reading approach to the Bible. We must, however, beware of only reading the Bible from this backwards perspective, lest we miss something that the text is giving to us when we read it forwards. Said another way, if we already know that the direction of the text is heading, and if we already know the end of the interpretation, is it possible that we will misunderstand what a simple forward reading of the text is saying? I believe this is happening with the question of Joseph and Ephraim in the Old Testament. A Christian reading of the Bible will lead us to reading the Bible Christologically. Again, it is right for us to do so. And when we read the Bible Christologically, we read the Old Testament through the lens of the tribe of Judah. We know that the story of the Old Testament must run through Judah. We know that King David is coming in the line of Judah. We know that the coming Messiah, Jesus, is coming through that line. Further, we know that when the kingdom divided, the northern tribes were led exclusively by wicked kings. While there were bad kings in the south, they were not exclusively wicked like the northern kings. We know that the exile that brought an end to the northern kingdom did not reach as far as Jerusalem, and so that southern tribe and kingdom was able to stand another 1.5 centuries after the fall of the northern kingdom. And so we might conclude that the story of the Bible runs through the tribe of Judah and the southern kingdom, and I would add to that we would say that it runs that way exclusively. This knowledge that the story would be running through the tribe of Judah in that way leads us to ask certain questions, particularly when we reach the story of Joseph in Genesis 37 to 50. Scholars often ask, why is there so much space devoted to a son who is not the main line of the story? Why does the story focus on Joseph and not Judah? And how do we interpret Joseph in light of this story? Samuel Emadi, in his recently published From Prisoner to Prince, The Joseph Story in Biblical Theology, says this: Moses affords Joseph more time in the foreground of the Genesis narrative than any other character in the book. A striking fact given the significance of Genesis' other main characters, Adam, Noah, and the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This prominence is even more striking considering the apparent insignificance of Joseph in the rest of the Old Testament. Emadi cites an older question posed by Brevard Childs in his Introduction to the Old Testament as Scripture. Concerning the role of Joseph in the book of Genesis, Childs writes this: the difficulty of the questions is raised immediately by the structure of the book of Genesis. The Joseph narratives are introduced by a Toledot formula in 37:2, which places him in line with the other patriarchs. The stories of Joseph then occupy a position in the book roughly equal to those of Abraham and Jacob. Nevertheless, Joseph is clearly set apart from the earlier patriarchs. He does not form part of the triad to whom the promise of land and posterity is given, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Rather, he becomes the first to whom the promise He becomes the first to whom the promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is reiterated. But then he says this at the end: if Joseph is not the bearer of the promise in the same way as his forefathers, what then is his role in Genesis? Childs appears to be asking these questions because he knows that the story is not supposed to run through Joseph. How else do we explain his hesitancy to affirm what the text seems to make explicit? What do I mean by what the text makes explicit? Well, let's look at two scenes at the end of the book of Genesis. I'm going to begin by reading an extended text from Genesis 48, and part of this will be on the screen, but much of it will not be. So if you want to follow along with me, I'm going to be reading from Genesis 48, beginning in verse 3 of that chapter. Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me. He said to me, I will make you fruitful and numerous. I will make many nations come from you, and I will give this land as a permanent possession to your future descendants. Your 2 sons born to you in the land of Egypt are now mine. Ephraim and Manasseh belong to me just as Reuben and Simeon do. Children born to you after them will be yours and will be recorded under the names of their brothers with regard to their inheritance. When I was returning from Paddan, to my sorrow, Rachel died along the way, some distance from Ephrath in the land of Canaan. I buried her there along the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. When Israel saw Joseph's sons, he said, who are these? And Joseph said to his father, these are my sons God has given me here. So Israel, that is Jacob, said, bring them to me and I will bless them. Now his eyesight was poor because of old age. He could hardly see. Joseph brought them to him, and he kissed and embraced them. Israel said to Joseph, I never expected to see your face again, but now God has even let me see your offspring. Then Joseph took them from his father's knees and bowed with his face to the ground. Then Joseph took them both, with his right hand Ephraim toward Israel's left, and with his left hand Manasseh towards Israel's right, and he brought them to Israel. But Israel stretched out his right hand and put it on the head of Ephraim, the younger, and crossing his hands, put his left on Manasseh's head, although Manasseh was the firstborn. Then he blessed Joseph and said, the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all harm, may he bless these boys, and may they be called by my name and the names of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and may they grow to be numerous within the land. When Joseph saw that his father had placed his right hand on Ephraim's head, he thought it was a mistake, and he took his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's. Joseph said to his father, not that way, my father. This one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head. But his father refused and said, I know, my son, I know. He too will become a tribe. He too will be great. Nevertheless, his younger brother will be greater than he, and his offspring will become a populous nation. So he blessed them that day, putting Ephraim before Manasseh, when he said, the nation Israel will invoke blessings by you, saying, may God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. And Israel said to Joseph, look, I'm about to die, but God will be with you and will bring you back to the land of your fathers. Over and above what I am giving your brothers, I am giving you the one mountain slope that I took from the Amorites with my sword and bow. Now, I read this passage at length because I want you to hear the dimensions of a puzzling but fascinating conversation. At this point in the Genesis narrative, we know that Joseph was the beloved son of Jacob. The story has told us that earlier. He was the firstborn of his mother, Rachel. Rachel was the wife that Jacob loved. But for his father, Jacob, Joseph was the 11th born son. The blessing of Jacob will be given in the following chapter, chapter 49. We're going to look at that in a moment. So we don't have that information of what that will look like. But why is this important? Because the blessing of Ephraim comes unexpectedly. We're not expecting it in chapter 48. It is unanticipated in the narrative. Jacob blessed his grandson before he blessed one of his own sons. Now, Jacob told us that in his mind he was not blessing his grandson, for he told Joseph, your two sons are now mine. When he blessed Ephraim, he was in effect blessing him as one of his own sons. But the second puzzling aspect of the conversation is the reversal of Manasseh and Ephraim. And the narrator goes to great lengths and tremendous detail to tell the reader that the brothers were being switched. And I'm quoting here again, with his right hand Ephraim towards Israel's left, with his left hand Manasseh towards Israel's right. Israel stretched out his right hand, put it on the head of Ephraim the younger, crossed his hands and put his left hand on Manasseh's head, although Manasseh was the firstborn. Notice the amount of detail in the text here. The narrator tells us of Joseph's plan to put the older on his left and the younger on his right so that they would be properly placed before Jacob. Then the narrator says that Jacob crosses his hand, repeats for the reader the birth order of each son. He's gone to great lengths to make sure the reader does not miss what is happening in the reversal of the birth order of the sons. But for the attentive reader of Genesis, this maneuver was not necessary at all. Because you see, it is a feature of the Genesis story that from Abraham on, every single birth narrative or story of a blessing includes a reversal of the birth order. And this reversal ends up being a significant narrative piece. In no case, there are no exceptions to this, in no case is the natural firstborn son the one who receives the blessing of the father. Abraham's firstborn son Ishmael is rejected in favor of Isaac. God even goes so far as to call Isaac, in Genesis 22, Abraham's only son, as if Ishmael didn't even exist anymore. Isaac's sons, Esau and Jacob, are famously juxtaposed while still in the womb, even before the deceptions that Jacob practiced against his brother and father in stealing both the birthright and the blessing. We are coming to Jacob's sons presently, but there is another narrative that could slip by. Judah infamously had twin sons by his son's widow, who had dressed as a prostitute in order to entrap her father-in-law. For those of you who try to preach about family values using the Old Testament, I just want you to let that one sink in. At their birth, the midwife, for some unexplained reason, is ready with a red thread to tie around whichever child comes from the womb first. A hand emerges, and the midwife quickly ties the red thread around the wrist before the hand then re-enters the womb. By doing that, she has marked the natural firstborn son that has come of these two boys. But then out comes his brother with no red string. And then finally, the firstborn son reemerges in toto. Perez, the younger son, broke through ahead of the firstborn brother, Zerah, and from then on, the messianic line is counted through the secondborn son, Perez. So when Joseph approaches Jacob with his two sons, the older Manasseh and the younger Ephraim, we are not surprised that the narrator provided a very convoluted text demonstrating the reversal of the two. What we are witnessing in the tales of the patriarchs in the book of Genesis is that in every single case, with no exceptions, the law of what we call primogeniture, the law of the firstborn, is reversed. The reason for this reversal is never explained, but it is clearly a feature of the patriarchal narrative in Genesis. Now, we're going to turn our attention to Genesis 49, and these sections will get briefer as we go. I think that's probably a tendency of people, is to write strongly at the beginning and taper off as you go. So there's a lot of detail at the beginning. As we go, it's going to go much quicker. The blessing of Joseph. Now let us turn our attention to Genesis 49. In this chapter, Jacob gathered his sons to himself in order to tell them what would happen in days to come. Now, while it is true that at the end of the chapter, the narrator tells us, this is in verse 28, the narrator tells us he blessed them and he blessed each one with a suitable blessing, it is also true we must recognize that the word bless only occurs in the words to one of the 12 sons. And it's to Joseph. Let us read what Jacob said to Joseph now in Genesis 49, verses 22 to 26. Joseph is a fruitful vine beside a spring. Its branches climb over the wall. The archers attacked him, shot at him, and were hostile toward him. Yet his bow remained steady, and his strong arms were made agile by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob, by the name of the shepherd, the rock of Israel. By the God of your father who helps you, and by the Almighty who blesses you with the blessings of the heavens above, blessings of the deep that lies below, and blessings of the breasts and the womb. The blessings of your father excel the blessings of my ancestors, and the bounty of the ancient hills. May they rest on the head of Joseph, on the brow of the prince of his brothers. With these words, Jacob blessed his son Joseph. This blessing has to be considered among the most effusive in all of the Bible. There is no subtlety to the blessing. It is not mixed with blessings to the other sons, other than in the narrator's terminology at the conclusion of the scene. Jacob does not use the word bless or any kind of synonym with any of the other 11 sons. If we are reading the Bible forward to this point, there is no other path of interpretation than to say that we must trace the line of the blessing and the election by God from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, then to Joseph, and finally to Ephraim. But still we have our backwards reading of the Bible. We know the end of the story. We know, and that rightfully influences the way we read the story going forward. So Dwayne Garrett, in his book Rethinking Genesis, and just so there's no confusion, I'm going to disagree with him at this point. It'll sound like I'm agreeing with him, but I think he's wrong here. But don't tell him that if you're in touch with him. Dwayne Garrett, in Rethinking Genesis, shows that the story clearly portrays Judah as the new firstborn of Jacob, supplanting Reuben, Simeon, and Levi. Garrett is very clear at this point. I don't have this quote on the screen for you, but he says this, quote, "A special bounty is promised to Joseph, but the right of the firstborn is not." And he goes on to say that the right of the firstborn goes to Judah. The Bible, however, despite what Garrett says, the Bible, however, does not allow us to conclude as he does. And the author of Chronicles will help us at this point in very unequivocal terms. So 1 Chronicles 5, 1-2 says, this is the beginning of the genealogy of Reuben. if you're familiar with the beginnings of the book of Chronicles. Verses 1 and 2 say, "These were the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel. He was the firstborn, but his birthright was given to the sons of Joseph, the son of Israel. Because Reuben defiled his father's bed, he is not listed in the genealogy according to birthright. Although Judah became strong among his brothers and a ruler came from him, the birthright was given to Joseph." Now, what is interesting here is that the chronicler is very interested in telling the story of the tribe of Judah, if you understand the historical context of the writing of the book of Chronicles. For him to claim that the prominence of the tribes of Joseph goes against his own interests in giving the history of Judah. Now, before leaving this part of the narrative, I do want to ask about Judah, though. What is going on with Judah here? Because this will be important for us in our conclusions. Have I taken from Judah his role in the biblical narrative? Certainly not. What I am saying, however, is that rather than expressing surprise and trying to figure out why Joseph has been emphasized, the real question for us is why Judah received the prophetic word that he did in Genesis 49. Ian Duguid and Matthew Harmon have gotten close to the right question when they say this, quote, "Even though the longest and the richest blessing," and I would add the only blessing, "was reserved for Joseph, the blessing on Judah," and again I would say the so-called blessing, "was the most remarkable." Let me say that again without my interjections. Even though the longest and richest blessing was reserved for Joseph, the blessing on Judah was the most remarkable. Now, to be fair, I don't know that Duguid and Harmon think it is remarkable for the reason that I do. They continue on after this quote, drawing up the great biblical themes about David and Solomon and Jesus, and it is remarkable for them because of the importance of the promise later on. For me, on the other hand, it is remarkable because when this word comes in Genesis 49, it is wholly unexpected, this word to Judah. There is absolutely nothing in the story to that point that indicates that Judah is anything other than one of the conniving brothers out to get what he can out of the exploitation of Joseph. In fact, the only extended narrative about Judah, I've mentioned this before, emphasizes a horrible moral problem between him and his widowed daughter-in-law, Tamar. If we have any opinion of Judah when reading the Bible forward to Genesis 49, that opinion should only be one of concern over his immoral treatment of his daughter-in-law and his very ill treatment of his brother Joseph. Now, to be fair here, it can be fairly said that in each of these cases, Judah expresses a certain remorse, and there is a reversal of sorts. I want to acknowledge that, and I think it fits into a larger narrative in a different way, but it is clear that Judah's reversals do not earn him or otherwise indicate that he has become the firstborn. And so this prophetic word about him in Genesis 49, about Judah, should be unexpected and a surprise to us if we are reading the Bible forward. Let me say one more thing about Judah. While the topic of this lecture is Joseph and his son Ephraim in biblical theology, I need to say just a few more words about the promise concerning Judah. In Jacob's words to Judah in Genesis 49, we clearly see a royal promise. I'm not going to read this text here, and I probably should have included it here, but it's earlier in chapter 49, but it's a text that's probably very familiar to you. But we do see a royal promise, that much is clear. What is less clear is the meaning of the second half of the words to Judah. There is language there concerning Judah washing his robes in wine, in the blood of grapes. There are several possible meanings of the imagery there. It could be an extension of the royal picture, showing both wealth and royalty in the dyeing and washing of clothing in purple. It could be a military image, similar to what we see in Revelation 19, when Jesus appears riding on a white horse, and the hem of his robe is stained in blood from the battle that he has waged. Less certain is that the blood of grapes could be a sacrificial image, linking to the blood of the sacrifices that we find later, primarily but not exclusively, in the book of Leviticus. But my conclusion here, and this is a very tentative conclusion because this is not the subject of the paper here, but my conclusion is that Judah has been given a surprising prophecy that from him a ruler will come, and that there is some sort of royal / militaristic / sacrificial picture of Judah's future. That there is a royal military, and sacrificial picture in Judah's future. Now, to sum up what we've seen thus far, I am suggesting that for the first-time reader of Genesis who does not know the rest of the biblical narrative, that they would not be surprised by the prominence of Joseph in chapters 37 to 50. He has been prepared for this in part by the recurring theme of the birthright and blessing falling from the biological firstborn son to a later heir. Thus, the reader is not surprised at the passing by of Reuben. The only question then is which son the blessing is going to fall to. The narrative makes clear that that son is Joseph. That blessing in chapter 49 and the blessing of Ephraim in chapter 48 only confirm what the reader already sees. So we should expect at this point that the story of Israel in the Old Testament runs prominently through the tribe of Ephraim. I should make one additional note. I'm not the first to point out the importance of Joseph in the narrative of Genesis. In the book that I cited earlier, Samuel Imadi, this is a recent book, it just came out this summer. But in this book I quoted from earlier, he has done a satisfactory job of showing that the narrative in Genesis should rightly be read, at least in part, as running through Joseph. But where I differ with Imadi is in our understanding of the meaning of the Joseph narrative. For Imadi and others, Joseph is read as a type of Christ, even though he is outside of the Judean and the Davidic line that leads us to Jesus. In brief, they see this typology at work in the portrayal of Joseph as the nearly morally perfect and also as being nearly morally perfect, and also in his role as a ruler over his brothers. Now, while I do not want to deny the validity of this typological relationship of looking at Joseph as a type of Christ to come, I do want to say that Joseph seems to have an importance in the narrative in and of himself, without reference to a prophetic or a typological significance. We're going to continue into the next portion of this. It's going to move into a text in the book of Kings with the division of the kingdom. But before we look at that next text in Kings, I want to take just a moment to see what comes of the tribe of Ephraim following the book of Genesis, in between Genesis and the institution of the monarchy. Israel's history could be said to be dominated by three leaders. The first of these, Moses, was from the tribe of Levi, which led to the institution of the priesthood under Moses' brother Aaron. The second great leader was Joshua, who was from the tribe of Ephraim. The third leader was Samuel. Now, there is some ambiguity about Samuel's genealogy in the Old Testament. Essentially, the book of Samuel gives one genealogy for him. The book of Chronicles gives a different genealogy, or appears to give a different genealogy for Samuel. I don't want to get into the issues related to that, but if we follow the genealogy that is given in the book of Samuel, then we find out that Samuel is indeed from the tribe of Ephraim. So what we see then is that when we read the narrative as presented in the Pentateuch, from those books through Samuel, it is clear that after Moses, the landscape is dominated by two great Ephraimite leaders, Joshua and Samuel, and that's going to lead us then to the monarchy. Now, and again, I want to do one quick thing before moving into that, and that is to take a moment to describe the tribal allotments in Israel. This is the sort of the history lesson of what we're doing here. I want to see the layout of the land that will help you to see why Ephraim and his brother Manasseh were so significant in Israel. And so there's going to be a series of maps here. We will work through a short series of maps of Israel. The first map that you're seeing is likely similar to what you would see in the back of your own Bible. We see the promised land and the division of the tribes as described in the book of Joshua. Now, I have a new computer and a new pen. I was able to make some markings on the map. And so in the next slide, I was able to use this pen to show the boundaries of the northern kingdom labeled Israel and the southern kingdom labeled Judah. I perhaps should have chosen a different color for that, but there it is. On the next map, I'm indicating to you the location of the tribal allotment of Ephraim. Now, if you should note a few things here, and this is, if you look carefully, perhaps not on this map, but in your own Bibles, you will see the tribes of Dan and Benjamin in between Judah and Ephraim. Dan will later migrate to the very north of Israel and will abandon this place by the sea. Benjamin has a checkered history and will eventually be grouped with Judah. And we see this especially in the post-exilic works of Ezra and Nehemiah, which mention repeatedly the exile of Judah and Benjamin. together. So as a result of Dan's migration and Benjamin's siding with Judah, we can see that Ephraim is the first tribe encountered when moving from Judah north into Israel, into the northern kingdom. On the final map, I've indicated the area covered by both Ephraim and Manasseh, the combination of which could be called the tribes of Joseph, and which does go by that moniker sometimes in the Old Testament. Notice that the two tribes together, if you can make out the markings there, take up what is likely more than half of the whole of the northern kingdom. Now, let's take a look at 1 Kings chapter 11. And we're coming now to the second scene that I want to look at, and we're getting near the end here. 1 Kings 11 tells of the end of Solomon's reign. How did we get from Samuel to Solomon? Very briefly, Samuel ushered in the time of the first king, Saul. Now, Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin. Having a Benjaminite king must have been an odd thing for an Israelite who had read Genesis and knew of the promise to Judah that a king would come from Judah. The king was supposed to come from Judah and not Benjamin. When the reign of Saul collapsed and God called David as the king of God's choosing, the story was then set right. Now a man of Judah would reign over his brothers. Following the death of David, Solomon, his son, became king. We read in 1 Kings 1 through 10 of the glory of Solomon's reign, perhaps most notably in his building of the temple that had been planned by David before him. Solomon's story, however, ends with a sad description of his apostasy and God's rejection of Solomon as king. Here's what the Lord said to Solomon. This is in 1 Kings 11, verses 11 to 13. God is speaking directly to Solomon, and he says, "Since you have done this and did not keep my covenant and my statutes, which I commanded you," and this here is that he was built up idols for all of his wives and went and worshiped all of those idols and false gods. "I will tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant. However, I will not do it during your lifetime for the sake of your father David. I will tear it out of your son's hand. Yet I will not tear the entire kingdom away from him, but I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem that I chose." Later in that same chapter, we're going to meet this new king, Jeroboam. He is from the tribe of Ephraim. And the following event transpires. I'm reading now from 1 Kings 11, verses 29 to 39. "During that time, the prophet Ahijah the Shilonite met Jeroboam on the road as Jeroboam came out of Jerusalem. Now Ahijah had wrapped himself with a new cloak, and the two of them were alone in the open field. Then Ahijah took hold of the new cloak he had on. He tore it into 12 pieces, and to Jeroboam he said, 'Take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord God of Israel says. I am about to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand, and I will give you 10 tribes. But one tribe will remain his for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city that I chose out of all the tribes of Israel. For they have abandoned me. They have bowed down to Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, to Chemosh, the god of Moab, and to Milcom, the god of the Ammonites. They have not walked in my ways to do what is right in my sight and to carry out my statutes and my judgments as his father David did. However, I will not take the whole kingdom from him, but I will let him be ruler all the days of his life for the sake of my servant David, whom I chose and who kept my commands and my statutes. I will take 10 tribes of the kingdom from his son and give them to you. I will give one tribe to his son so that my servant David will always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city I chose for myself to put my name there. I will appoint you, and you will reign as king over all you want, and you will be king over Israel. After that, if you obey all that I command you, walk in my ways and do what is right in my sight in order to keep my statutes and my commands as my servant David did, then I will be with you, and I will build you a lasting dynasty just as I built for David. And I will give you Israel. I will humble David's descendants because of their unfaithfulness, but not forever." Now, notice what God has said both to Solomon directly and to Jeroboam through the prophet Ahijah. He was taking the kingdom from Solomon and giving it to Jeroboam. Jeroboam did not steal the kingdom from Solomon. God gave it away. God did not divide the kingdom. He gave the kingdom to Jeroboam. And then he reserved one tribe for David's descendant. Now, to be sure, the result at the end was that there was what we call a divided kingdom. But to imagine that God said to Solomon that he was taking a portion of the kingdom from him and giving it to someone else is simply not what the text is saying. Rather, God took the entire kingdom from Solomon and only then, almost as an afterthought, reserved one tribe because of the covenant with David. And God added, again, almost as an afterthought, that he would not take the kingdom from Solomon himself, but would rather take it from his son, Rehoboam. Finally, notice that God used language with Jeroboam very similar to what was used with David in the establishment of David's dynasty. God said to David, back in 2 Samuel 7, I took you from the pasture, from tending the flock, to be ruler over my people Israel. But to Jeroboam, God simply said, I will appoint you, and you will reign as king over all that you want, and you will be king over Israel. To David, God said, your house and kingdom will endure before me forever, and your throne will be established forever. To Jeroboam, God said, I will build you a lasting dynasty, just as I built for David, and I will give you Israel. There is an additional facet of the conversation between Ahijah and Jeroboam to note, and it is the dividing or tearing of the robe. Let us leave aside this new math that is presented in the scene. You divide the robe into 12 pieces, give 10 to Jeroboam, keep 1 for Judah. Where's the 12th piece? We don't know. The tearing of the robe should remind the reader of the scene between Saul and Samuel. When Samuel declared that God was removing Saul as the king, at one point in the narrative, Saul falls on the ground clutching at Samuel's robe, but the robe tore in his hand. And Samuel turned on him and he said, in the same way God is tearing the kingdom out of your hand, we should think of Ahijah's tearing of the robe in the same way. God is tearing away the kingdom from Solomon, just as he did with Saul. Yet not completely. God preserved a place and a role for the Davidic king. And we're going to come back to that in our conclusions. Keith Bodner, in his book, The Theology of the Book of Kings, is typical of a problem in understanding the force of the division of the kingdom following the reign of Solomon. Bodner makes 3 statements describing the division. Within the same paragraph, he makes these 3 statements. He says, after Solomon's death, the kingdom will be ripped away and given to one of his servants. Then he goes on to say, there is a partial mitigation of this penalty because of the Davidic covenant. And so we are led to infer, because God adds that one tribe will remain under the control of Solomon's son for the sake of David my servant and for the sake of Jerusalem that I have chosen. But then in the following sentence, Bodner says, the penalty for Solomon's divided heart, as it were, is a divided kingdom, a fissure that will be abruptly exposed after Solomon's death. The fact that a servant will inherit a substantial portion of the kingdom has shades of the Saul-David conflict in the book of 1 Samuel. Bodner, we see, has shifted almost seamlessly from saying that the kingdom will be ripped away to having a servant, quote unquote, inherit a substantial portion. These 2 descriptions seem hardly compatible with one another. Now, thus far, we've focused on the place of Joseph and Ephraim in the book of Genesis. And, yeah, we can do this. Thus far, we've focused on the place, sorry, I'm looking at the time here. The place of Joseph and Ephraim in the book of Genesis, and then the reasons leading to the division of the northern tribes as the nation of Israel. The purpose in Genesis was to show that the election and the blessing of God was traced from Abraham through Isaac, Jacob, and then to Joseph and his son Ephraim. In Kings, we wanted to show that the division of the kingdom was orchestrated by God and that his people Israel were the 10 northern tribes. The final piece of the puzzle that we will look at today is the larger narrative that stretches from 1 Kings 13 all the way to 2 Kings 17. We're not going to look at all of that here. I'm going to describe the form of this. The narrative begins with the story of the division of the kingdom and ends with the fall of the northern kingdom during the Assyrian invasion of 722 BC. This section of my presentation will not look at the details of a particular story as in the first 2 sections. Rather, this section will look at an aspect of the form of the story. When you read the books of Kings and Chronicles, you are confronted with 2 very different types of material. when you're reading through the book of Kings, for example. The first is what we would call a royal formula, and you are familiar with this. These formulas are brief, highly structured passages that tell the details of the reign of a king. And you will recognize the form in the following passage. And let me just read this. Now Rehoboam, Solomon's son, reigned in Judah. Rehoboam was 41 years old when he became king. He reigned 17 years in Jerusalem, the city where Yahweh had chosen from all the tribes of Israel to put his name. Rehoboam's mother's name was Naamah the Ammonite. Judah did what was evil in the Lord's eyes. They provoked him to jealous anger more than all their ancestors had done with the sins they committed. They also built for themselves high places, sacred pillars, and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every green tree. There were even male cult prostitutes in the land. They imitated all the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had dispossessed before the Israelites. In the 5th year of King Rehoboam, Shishak, king of Egypt, went to war against Jerusalem. He seized the treasuries of the Lord's temple, the treasuries of the royal palace. He took everything. He took all the gold shields that Solomon had made. King Rehoboam made bronze shields in their place, committed them into the care of the captains of the royal escorts who guarded the entrance to the king's palace. Whenever the king entered the Lord's temple, the royal escorts would carry the shields. Then they would take them back to the royal escorts' armory. The rest of the events of Rehoboam's reign, along with all of his accomplishments, are written about in the historical record of Judah's kings. There was war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam throughout their reigns. Rehoboam rested with his fathers, was buried with his fathers in the city of David. His mother's name was Naamah the Ammonite, and his son Abijam became king in his place. Now, I needed to read that at length because I wanted you to hear this. These royal formulas give a chronology of when a king came into power, how long he reigned, a moral evaluation of his reign, a few important events of the reign, a documentary notice, and a report on the king's death and his successor. It is important to recognize that these passages are not narratives. They are closer to what we might find in an encyclopedia entry today. They are not similar at all to what we find, for example, in the long narrative of Elijah during the reign of Ahab in the north. Now, once we see, and this is the key here, once we see that the narrative in the book of Kings is different from these, what we might call encyclopedic royal formulas, it is interesting to note that from 1 Kings 13 to 2 Kings 17, from the division of the kingdom to the fall of Samaria, the northern kingdom, the verses devoted to the northern kingdom comprise about 81% of that total. And the 19% that concerns Judah in the south is almost exclusively made up of these royal formulas that I've just described. In other words, the narrative story being told from the division of the kingdom to the fall of Samaria is entirely devoted to the northern kingdom. Judah in the south has only these encyclopedic entries. There's an exception to that I'm going to pass over here because I'm already 2 minutes over here. And so I'm going to go to my concluding remarks here, which are brief. I have tried today to convince you that the blessing and the right of the firstborn passed from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob and then to Joseph and his son Ephraim. I've also tried to show you that after the reign of Solomon, God took his kingdom and he gave it to an Ephraimite to rule over. He kept one tribe reserved because of the covenant with David. If I have convinced you today that the narrative of the Old Testament as given to us in the Old Testament wants to be read primarily through the lens of the northern kingdom, what do we gain through this? First, we can read the Old Testament not as a single monolithic tale that leads us to Christ, but rather as a more nuanced story that has several parallel parts. And I would describe the situation in this way. The narrative of Judah is telling us the story of the royal and the redeeming tribe. From Judah will come a king and will come a savior. But who will be ruled? And perhaps more importantly, who is it that will be redeemed? Is it Judah? Yes, but only in a very small part. For the people of God who have gone astray and who need to be saved are Ephraim, the northern kingdom. Ephraim is the object of God's redeeming act through Judah. So we can read the story of the Old Testament in these two streams, the people of God and the efforts of God that God is taking to save those people. Second, we can read other parts of the Old Testament in a more nuanced fashion. If we have fallen prey to the notion that the northern kingdom is always wicked and the southern kingdom of Judah is the good line that leads to Christ, then we will reject too quickly God's people. But now we can read the stories of God's longing to save Israel, this northern kingdom, as we see in a book like Hosea most clearly, without rejecting them as utter failures. But third, and this is my last point, related to what was just said, our overly hasty generalization of Israel as wicked and Judah as good in some sense might lead us astray as we seek ourselves in the Old Testament story. If we read the Old Testament and place ourselves in some way into the narrative of Judah, we may be placing ourselves in the wrong part of the story. If we think of ourselves as in some sense analogous to the faithful remnant of Judah, we will miss the fact that each of us is totally depraved, and we would go the way of Israel did in the north. We would abandon the Lord as quickly as Jeroboam did when he was made king, and as a first act built golden calves as idols for Israel. In fact, we have already built our own idols in rejection of God's rule in our lives, and if we are not made painfully aware of that fact, we will miss out on the salvation offered to us by our royal Redeemer, the Son of Judah, the Son of David, Jesus our Lord. And that concludes the lecture today. Thank you.